Hello, everyone, and welcome to Orthodoxy. My name is Andy Schmidt, and I am back with another podcast. I'm super excited for this one with Robert P. George from Princeton University. Robert P. George is McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. He has served as Chairman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, and before that on the President's Council on Bioethics and as a presidential appointee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. He has also served as U.S. member of the UNESCO's World Commission on the Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology. He's a former Judicial Fellow at the Supreme Court of the United States, where he received the Justice Tom C. Clark Award. He's a graduate of Oxford University, Harvard University, and he has been a visiting professor at Harvard Law School and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Robert P. George, an amazing thinker. He's written many books. He's one of the most important, most prominent conservative thinkers of our time. I don't think there's any question about that. We talked in this podcast a little bit about the election. Donald Trump won. And for those of you living under a rock, Donald Trump won. And I asked Robert if he expected that to happen, and what does that mean for the Republican Party? Is the Republican Party a conservative party anymore? And what do conservatives do about the lack of conviction in the Republican Party as it relates to abortion and even marriage? And so we talked about that a little bit, and we talked a lot about the abortion issue, how to come at those sorts of conversations with people who disagree with us on abortion. So people who are pro-abortion, how do we talk to them, and how do we convince them that their ideology is wrong, that their perspective is wrong? We also talked about a little bit about his book, Conscience and Its Enemies, a fantastic book confronting the dogmas of liberal secularism, and talked a lot about education, the purpose of education. What is education? What do we do when we're educating somebody? Is it indoctrination? Is the goal to just tell people what to think? Is the goal to kind of present a multitude of ideas and allow for people to dialogue and have conversation and debate? And so we have we kind of had that conversation where we discussed the purpose of education, and then why the public schools are failing and which ones are not failing, and if parents should send their kids to the public schools. We talked about a bunch of different things, and at the end we finally discussed Robert George's relationship and friendship with Cornel West. Cornel West ran for president as an independent this year, and he's definitely more progressive than Robert P. George is, and they disagree on a lot of things, but they have a great friendship. And I asked him, how did you do that? In an age like today where young people believe that you can't be friends with people that you disagree with, you can't even talk to them in certain scenarios, how did they develop a friendship in which they disagreed on serious political issues, but still cared for each other, still love each other? So we talked about that as well. It was a fantastic conversation. I feel honored to be able to interview Robert. I mean, he's a great thinker, and it was an honor to talk with him. So I hope you enjoy this podcast. Real quick before we get into the actual podcast, though, I want to talk about the sponsor on this episode. So some of you might know this because I've been working with, I mentioned it a couple of times, but I've been working with a film studio out of Minneapolis for the last year and a half, Rocket Sled Studios. It's a Christian film studio, and our goal is to create beautiful, good movies and TV shows that can actually impact the culture, that can win people to Christ, and that can be used in the same way that something like Chronicles of Narnia and Lord of the Rings can be used to proclaim stories that then lead people toward what Tolkien called the one true myth, the myth that is the gospel, that Jesus Christ, not the myth, but the true myth, that is the gospel of Jesus Christ, that God came down and lived and died for our sins, that we can be reconciled to him through the truth of his gospel and belief in him. And our goal is to make movies and TV shows and animated kids series and things like that are pointing toward Christ. And so they're going to sponsor this podcast, and we're gonna play the promo video here in a second that we developed that tells us a little bit about a project that we're working on, the main project that we're working on, called Tales of the Kingdom. Tales of the Kingdom is a series of books written by David and Karen Maines in the 80s. They wrote these books kind of in the vein of the same fantasy, Christian fantasy, like Chronicles of Narnia and The Lord of the Rings. And we got the rights to try to turn these into an animated children's series. And we're super excited. We need to raise a lot of money, and we're working on that right now. And so we have a promo video that I'll show you right now.
Imagine you've had a long, hard day, and nothing sounds better than planting yourself in front of the TV. But then your children or your grandchildren walk in, and they want to watch too. What would you turn on? Actually answer that question. What TV show or movie would you feel good about watching together? Allow me to dig a bit deeper. How much influence do you think these screens will have on this generation? I'm not saying this device is evil. It can be. But it's also an opportunity. This is where the eyeballs are today. And if the body of Christ doesn't reach them here, then we don't exist to them. The real question is, how do you reach a generation that doesn't always seem like they want to hear the truth? The answer? Story. There's a saying that he who tells the stories shapes the culture. And I believe that so much of the lostness and confusion that we experience every day in our culture is because of the stories that we consume. Imagine if we could promote stories that talked about goodness and truth and beauty. That is what Tales of the Kingdom is all about. And now, on its 40th anniversary, we intend to transform those beloved best-selling books into an animated series. We have the stories, we've developed the artwork, and we've built the team necessary to bring this series to life. And with your help, we can have the first episode here in as little as 1 year, and the rest won't be far behind. Storytelling is the key to capturing hearts and minds, and I am convinced that there is no greater investment that we can make in the next generation. So I want to genuinely ask you, what are you investing in today that will directly impact your children, your grandchildren, and the whole generation that they're part of, including kids around the world who've never even heard the story of God? This animated series is an investment that will shape and mold your children into the men and women you prayed they would become. Consider investing in Tales of the Kingdom today, and we will gladly include your name as a producer in the credits that your kids can point to for years to come. Thank you, and God bless.
All right. So that's the promo video. I hope you enjoyed watching that, and I'm super excited for this episode with Robert P. George. I hope you enjoy. All right, so I'm here with Robert P. George. Do you go by Robert George or Robert P. George? Do you prefer a certain one?
I'll answer to anything.
I'll answer anything. Perfect. Well, I mean, obviously, we're coming a couple days ago. We had an election. It was a very interesting election. Things changed. Donald Trump was elected, and I'm interested in hearing, just kind of before we get into some of the other things that we'll talk about, what your thoughts are on the election. What were you thinking was going to happen going into it? And then were you surprised by the outcome?
I was not surprised by the outcome. It had become clear to me several weeks ago that the momentum was with former President Trump and against Vice President Harris. There was a little blip right toward the end where the polls seemed to show Vice President Harris moving slightly ahead, very, very slightly ahead in two or three of the upper swing states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Ohio, and Wisconsin.
Yeah.
But that proved to be ephemeral. My one little surprise was that he won not only the Electoral College, he being former President Trump won the Electoral College, but also the popular vote. And I wasn't predicting that by any means.
Yeah, that was interesting. It felt similar to 2016 in some ways. You go into it and you're kind of like, I had thought he wasn't going to pull it off. And partially because I was part of a political campaign in Minnesota in 2022. A guy named Dr. Scott Jensen was running to be the governor of Minnesota against Tim Walz. And one of the things that I noticed was, I think 2022 was one of the first years where you had almost 50% or a little less than 50% of the voters in America were Gen Z or millennial. And so that's kind of a new voting bloc, younger people. I'm 25, I'm a Gen Zer. I know my generation. We are a generation of expressive individualism, liberalism. We're kind of the culmination of a lot of bad philosophy. And I just didn't think that it was going to be a red wave. And of course, it wasn't a red wave in 22. So I just thought that was just going to continue into 2024, that we were just going to keep voting Democrat, voting blue. So I was surprised that Trump won, to say the least. And so I guess this kind of begs the question, for the Republican Party, they put together this kind of big coalition of all these different characters. You have RFK, you have Musk, you have Joe Rogan endorsing Trump, and Tulsi Gabbard. And like, these people they're not like traditional Republicans. They're not even conservative. I'm wondering, as a Christian conservative, what does this mean for the future of the Republican Party? And actually, like, for conservatism, you're obviously a conservative. So do you think that the Republican Party, is it safe to say that they're no longer a conservative party, or what is the Republican Party in your opinion?
Well, it's a Trumpified party now.
Yeah.
And President Trump is not a convictional politician. Mm-hmm. He doesn't have beliefs or strong beliefs.
Yeah.
He has interests. He has desires. He threw the pro-life movement overboard when the pro-life cause became politically inconvenient for him to support, having pledged himself to be a true convert to the pro-life cause when he was seeking the presidency in 2016. Mm-hmm. So that shows that he really can't be trusted to stand up firm for principle when the going gets tough. Now, immediately, a defender of President Trump from the conservative side would point out, quite rightly, that, well, he did make good on his promise to appoint not pro-life justices, but constitutionalist justices, right, who would, as constitutionalists, reverse the terrible decision in Roe against Wade, mm-hmm, which is a constitutionally illegitimate decision, or was a constitutionally illegitimate decision, whether or not you like a policy of, or prefer a policy, or believe in a policy of legal abortion. It's simply because there's nothing in the text or logic or structure or original understanding of the Constitution or any of its provisions that would warrant doing what the Supreme Court did in 1973 in Roe versus Wade, and mm-hmm, fabricating a so-called constitutional right to abortion. But, of course, at that point, President Trump's personal political interests lined up with what the pro-life cause needed, which was the reversal of Roe versus Wade. Mm-hmm. After the reversal of Roe versus Wade, we got a tremendous backlash against the Dobbs mm-hmm decision that had overturned it. It energized and activated the left-wing base, the socially left-wing base of the Democratic Party, and became a political liability. Now, that was true for Republican politicians across the board, and different ones handled it differently. President Trump basically threw the pro-life movement under the bus. He removed pro-life language from the platform, also removed the pro-marriage language from the Republican platform. Yeah. In both cases, this language had been in for many decades, and conservatives, and especially religious conservative folks in the Republican Party, had fought successfully against efforts to eliminate that language. Well, mm-hmm, President Trump and his people eliminated it in one fell swoop, with virtually no discussion or opportunity for dissent or resistance of any kind. By contrast, Governor Ron DeSantis down in Florida, despite the backlash, stood fast and firm for his pro-life principles. Mm-hmm. And in 2022, despite the backlash, in a state that was still somewhat purplish, nevertheless prevailed by a landslide. He was reelected by a 60-40 margin in a state where he had been elected the first time by only a few thousand votes. Mm-hmm. And now in 2024, instead of cutting and running on pro-life issues, Governor DeSantis, once again, stood firm and stood strong in the face of this backlash, for pro-life convictions, and he managed to defeat the dreadful Amendment 4, which would have created abortion on demand for all intents and purposes through 9 months in Florida. So different politicians handled it differently. As a pro-life person myself, of course, I want to praise Governor DeSantis' handling of the issue. He showed genuine courage, genuine principle, but that's because he's a convictional politician. He's a person who's in this because he has beliefs and he wants those beliefs to be advanced. President Trump is not, and I don't say this to deprecate the guy or run him down. Everybody knows it. He's not a convictional politician. He's not like Reagan, or for that matter, FDR. He's going to do what his political self-interest suggests his doing. And in recent history, that means trying to push himself as far away from the pro-life cause as possible. So he not only removed the pro-life language from the Republican platform, he vowed that he would veto any federal legislation to protect unborn human beings. After having earlier, when he was running for president and needed pro-life support, vowed that he would push for such legislation. Even beyond that, he announced that even though he now says abortion is an issue exclusively for the states in which the federal government would have no role, that's why he would veto the federal abortion legislation. He even expressed his opposition to some very valuable, important pro-life legislation at the state level, such as heartbeat bills, which would protect unborn babies from the lethal violence of abortion once heart function was detected, heartbeat was detected. He criticized the Florida law, a very strong, wonderful pro-life law. He criticized the Florida law as not giving women enough weeks to have abortions. All the while, having said that he was pro-life, he sends his wife, Melania, out a matter of weeks before the election to announce that she is ardently pro-abortion and that she thinks it's the most fundamental of all rights, and and she ends up with the position that Kamala Harris had.
The same language and everything, the liberation,
same language and everything. So, that's the reality that we're dealing with. So that's one example of the Trumpification of the Republican Party. So it's no longer a pro-life party, at least for now. I want it back, but I have to say at the moment it's not. It's no longer a pro-marriage party. Let's be serious. Let's be real. He deliberately removed the marriage plank from the platform. It's no longer a socially conservative party. The coalition that he's put together is not one based on principles, at least not on socially conservative principles. The people you mentioned, Elon Musk and Tulsi Gabbard and Robert F. Kennedy and all those people, these are not pro-life people. These are not pro-traditional morality. Now, he continues to, he being President Trump and the people I mentioned, continue to proclaim themselves to be socially conservative on the issue of transgender ideology, puberty blockers for children, surgeries, men in women's sports, men in women's private spaces like locker rooms, shower rooms, shelters, prisons, and so forth. But I think, again, we have to be serious with ourselves here. Right now, being on the socially conservative side of the transgender issue or the gender ideology issues lines up with President Trump's political interests. When the day comes, if the day comes, when they no longer align with his political interests, we have no reason to think that he would do anything in that case different from what he has done in the case of abortion or marriage, which is to throw the socially conservative side under the bus. So there we are. But I want my party back. I want my party to be a socially conservative party. I want us to be a coalition. I want us to be Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim. I want us to be black, white, Latino, of every Asian, of every ethnicity. I want us to be a big tent in that sense. But I want us to be a party of conviction and principle, especially on the great traditional values issues, the great moral issues, the sanctity of human life in all stages and conditions, marriage as the conjugal union of husband and wife, religious freedom and the rights of conscience.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm on board with all of that. I obviously, well, I did. Okay, so this was the interesting thing, because when you're a Christian, and I'm Protestant, you're Catholic, but at the core level of let's say the dignity of the human person, we agree. Life starts at conception. Babies in the womb or outside of the womb are human beings. That's not a question for Christians.
Well, I mean, can I interrupt?
Yeah, go ahead.
You know that to be true, not because you looked it up in the Bible. Actually, the
Sure.
Bible doesn't tell us anything about the biological facts of when the life of a human being begins.
Yeah.
You know it, and I know it, for the same reason that everybody who's honest and decently well-informed knows it.
Yeah.
And that's because it's a matter of biological fact.
Right.
The life of a new human being begins at conception, with the coming together of sperm and egg and the formation of the zygote, that is the human being in the earliest embryonic stage. You have a new whole living member of the species Homo sapiens, distinct both genetically and functionally, who will, and I'm going to say he or she because sex is actually determined right at the beginning, who will, by a self-directed process, develop himself or herself from the embryonic into the fetal and infant and child and adolescent stages, and ultimately into adulthood with his or her determinateness and unity and identity fully intact. And you're the same human being you were when you were a 2-year-old toddler, when you were a 6-week newborn, when you were a 7-month fetus, when you were a 5-day-old embryo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. I actually would add, obviously there's the biological reasons, but as a Christian, we also know that's a human being, because human beings are more than just the biological makeup. I mean, we have souls, we have spirits. There's a sense in which, as a Christian, because there's the argument of, I've seen the pro-abortion people try to do the biological scientific argument. When is the heartbeat or when is the brain starting to work? But life is more than just what's physically happening inside of something. Because if the determination of whether or not a human being was on the basis of a heartbeat or brain waves or anything like that, then you would have to say that things that don't have a heartbeat aren't alive, which would then say that, plants and trees and things like that they're not alive. So life is more, at some capacity, I think it's more of a philosophical and theological argument or conversation than it is even a biological one. Would you agree with that, though? Like, when I'm trying to have conversations, I'm in Madison, Wisconsin, very liberal, very progressive. It's hard to be a conservative here.
New Jersey, it's not quite as bad, but it's pretty bad.
yeah, exactly. So
we're not
when
quite
you're
Madison, we're not.
And that's good. That's good. It's difficult because even the churches in Madison are, it's a big moral conundrum for these churches to try to figure out, is abortion wrong? And I mean, even a church I went to was a conservative church. They have abandoned the stance that abortion is wrong. They're supporting people, and they're supporting churches and giving money to and promoting these churches who think that murdering children is okay.
I get out of that church as fast as I could.
We got out very fast, and I called them and we talked to the elders and stuff, but then it was like, they're not interested. We're out. So I did get out. But when having these conversations, do you think it's more worthwhile to talk about the biological stuff? Because that's the first thing you brought up. Or do you think we should say, hey, look, we can talk biology and science all day, but there has to be some sort of agreement across the board that a human person is more than just a bunch of matter, and there's something spiritual, there's something more. I mean, we're having conversation with language. Language isn't necessarily something that all other animals and living creatures are able to engage with and use. And language isn't something you can put in a test tube. So like, what is language? I think that's indicative of something even deeper in the soul and something spiritual. So do you take the stance always of, let's start with the biology, or do you think it's okay to skip over that? Sometimes I just skip over that completely.
I don't think you can skip over it.
Sure.
You are right that we're more than merely biological creatures. There's something about us that's different from lions and tigers and bears and snakes and snails and amoebas and roses and dandelions and anything, a bacteria, viruses. Okay. So what is that? And that's a discussion we have to have. But all you need to successfully and conclusively make the pro-life case is the following. Your interlocutor just has to concede that it is wrong in principle to kill somebody.
Yeah.
All right. You decide who it's wrong to kill.
Yeah.
2-year-olds, is it wrong to kill 2-year-olds? Or if it's okay to kill 2-year-olds, is it okay to kill healthy 17-year-olds or what have you? Now, if it's wrong to kill somebody, that's because there's something about that somebody that is special enough that we don't treat that somebody, don't think we should treat that somebody like a lion or tiger or bear or a snake or snail or an amoeba or a rose bush or a dandelion or slug or anything like that.
Yeah.
Okay, then the question is, what is that?
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, the argument will conclude, I've been through it so many times, I can tell you where it goes, that it's going to be the possession of a rational nature.
Interesting.
The possession of a rational nature. So then the question is, well, do we have our rational nature accidentally or essentially?
Yeah.
Is it something that's intrinsic to who we are, or is it kind of imposed from the outside somehow?
Yeah.
And the answer to that question, which is no longer a biological question, but a metaphysical question, is you have it essentially. That means you have it in virtue of the kind of thing you are, not in virtue of some accidental quality that you have, like your height or your weight or your eye color, or you're left-handed or right-handed, or you're black or white or Asian or Latino or male or female. Okay. Now, you believe me, your interlocutor is going to want to avoid being stuck with the position that our dignity is an accidental matter. It has to do with our race or sex or ethnicity or something. He's going to say, no. It's intrinsic by virtue of our being a human being. Because your interlocutor, especially up there in Madison, is going to tell you, oh, I'm a strong believer and I'm a champion of human rights. What are human rights? Well, human rights are rights you have not in virtue of any achievement of yours, any your strength, your beauty, your health, your intelligence. It's just in virtue of being a human being. So then the question becomes, what is a human being?
Yeah.
Okay. And that is the biological question.
Yeah.
Now, you're clearly now a human being, right?
I think
were you
so,
always a human being? Or was there at some point where you were something other than a human being and then you became a human being?
Yeah, right.
Now there were periods in human history. There was many millennia ago. And actually, this was the case up until roughly the 1820s. When reasonable people of goodwill could speculate about whether something that isn't initially human becomes transformed into a human being.
Mm-hmm.
So you had theories such as the theory of the great Greek philosopher Aristotle. It was very influential, of course, with the medieval thinkers, including medieval Christian and Jewish and Muslim thinkers, who believed in what's sometimes called delayed hominization, that you don't immediately become a human being. You're something else, and then after a while, after some stages of development, you become a human being. That's all exploded now. Nobody believes that anymore. It's impossible to believe that. It's a scientific question. The science is resolved. It began to be resolved in the second half of the 1820s when the embryologist Kurt von Baer discovered the mammalian ovum. And that's when we began to figure out, we human beings began to figure out when the life of a new human being or any other mammal begins. Yeah. And now the embryology has settled the question. It doesn't begin at 2 years old. It doesn't begin at 7 weeks old. It doesn't begin at 6 months gestation. It doesn't begin at 5 days after conception. It begins with the formation of the zygote, the earliest embryonic stage, which is what happens when sperm and egg unite. And that's why you, who are now the 29-year-old or whatever you are, or 31-year-old, 25-year-old Andy Schmidt, is the same Andy Schmidt, the same living member of the species Homo sapiens, who was just a few years ago, 19-year-old college student, and then a 14-year-old freshman in high school, and before that a 6-year-old kid, and before that a 2-year-old rambunctious toddler, and then a couple of years before that a newborn infant, and a couple of months before that a 7-month fetus, and a few months before that a brand new conceived human being in the earliest embryonic stage. You're the same creature. And then that's it. Drop the mic. Argument's over.
Yeah. And
notice that whole argument. There was nothing in there about Genesis. or about the Bible
Sure.
or anything like that. Now, it's not to say that the Bible is not a source of tremendous wisdom about this.
Right.
But you don't need, and this is why you have lots of people who are not Christians, not Jews, don't believe in the Bible, or have don't give the Bible any special authority. People of all sorts of, even people who are unbelievers, who have no religion whatsoever, nevertheless understand that abortion is a grave injustice committed against the tiniest, most vulnerable member of the human family.
Yeah. Well, this is interesting because obviously when I reached out to you, I think I said, I've been trying to figure out, yes. So how does an Orthodox Christian conviction produce a good political philosophy? That's true. And because in Madison, there's this kind of idea in the churches that your conviction theologically doesn't really need to, you can compartmentalize. You don't really need to connect that to any other aspect of your life. You could be a Christian over here, but when you go to vote, you don't really have to be a Christian anymore. You could just kind of arbitrarily vote. And of course, that really doesn't make any sense. But one of the things
I have a question for the folks in Madison. Okay. So we get to pick and choose between which human beings we think are worthy of the protection of the laws and which ones aren't. So once you've landed there, then how do we go about picking and choosing? I mean, can we do it on the basis of race? Can we do it on the basis of sex? Can we do it on the basis of ethnicity? Can we do it on the basis of sexual orientation or preferences? Then we do it on the basis of hair color or eye color.
Right.
What's the basis? And by the way, you guys up in Madison, I thought you guys told me you believed in human equality. Well, if you believe in human equality, doesn't mean the equality of all human beings, that all human beings are bearers of profound, inherent, and equal dignity. Wait a minute. I'm not understanding. And wait a minute. You guys told me, you Madison people, or you Princeton people, you told me you were believers in human rights. Well, human rights are rights we have simply by virtue of being human. But now you're telling me there's some human beings, some members of the human family who are not bearers of those rights, which tells me you actually aren't believers in human rights. You believe people have their rights in virtue of some attainment or achievement of theirs, that they've reached a certain age or they're of a certain race or they're a certain height. Gosh, you guys are beginning to sound a little too much like those people you've condemned so sharply, those racists and those fascists. Gee, I'm just so perplexed.
I agree with you. I think that's exactly where it goes. I think there's a real, coherent sort of logical argument. But one of the things that I thought was interesting, so I read a book, you probably know of it, it's a very popular one, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman.
Yeah, Carl's a dear friend of mine. He's such a good man, such a good thinker.
That book is amazing. And it totally, changed my perspective. I'm a 25-year-old, grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, in a Christian family. But in Madison, there's so much progressivism. And so the idea, so I realized as I read that book that, wow, I'm much more of a expressive individualist than I thought that I was. And it was really helpful because adding the language to things, I realized, wow, this has impacted the way that the church in Madison has distorted the scriptures. And one of the things that was fascinating in that book was that he talks about the difference in fundamental worldviews. So there's like the mimetic worldview and the poetic worldview. And the mimetic worldview is essentially that we are kind of bound to natural law and that there are external forces that kind of impose themselves on us as human beings that we can't really change. And then the poetic worldview is essentially it's just everything's raw material and you can kind of do whatever you want and make whatever you want.
Self-manufacture. You manufacture your own mental moral universe.
Exactly. And so
Hitler would love that, by the way.
Absolutely.
Tell Hitler, you get to make up your own moral universe. In your moral universe, it's perfectly okay to murder people, right?
Exactly.
Because of their race, their religion, their ethnicity.
Right.
Hey, what is there not to like if you're Hitler?
And so, but with that, I can't remember if he talks about this in the book or if it was just something that I was thinking about, but it was like, okay, so that argument of the raw material, the poetic argument, you think about before 1800, I think maybe most people would be like, yeah, that's kind of ridiculous. Like, if it doesn't rain, we don't eat. The world kind of controls what we do in the real, material sense. If people didn't live past 30 or 40 years old, they didn't have all of the pharmaceuticals and the things that we have that have progressed from capitalism, and then in the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution. And in the Industrial Revolution, it really felt like we were taking raw material and creating whatever we wanted out of it, to the point in which now we're doing a podcast in 2 different states, miles and miles away from each other, on a device that doesn't really look, on a computer that doesn't really look like anything that you'll see out in nature. But it is a makeup of all these materials in nature. And so people would say, and I guess my thought was, well, yeah, maybe people think that we've progressed past the sort of mimetic worldview because of the technological advancements. Of course, that breaks down because we're still using the natural world to create the things that we're using, and you can't just make new material out of nothing. But at the end of the day, when the culture is looking at these things, the culture took on a different worldview as far as what the human person is meant for. And so I don't know exactly how that connects to abortion itself, but I can absolutely see that how people can get kind of deceived into thinking that transgenderism is okay, because I'm using my phone every single day, and that's just like a bunch of raw material formed into something that I want, I want it to be what I want it to be. So why can't I do that with my own body? I don't know. Do you think how are Christians and conservatives supposed to make the arguments against the poetic worldview in a world that's becoming more and more technologically integrated, even to the point of transhumanism, where we're integrating with technology itself, with Neuralink and things like that? What do you think about all of that? And it's a big question. Sorry, but what do you think?
Sure. I think in making the argument, again, the first thing you have to ask your interlocutor, the person who's saying abortion's okay, or, people should be able to marry trees, or whatever their latest idea is.
Right.
All you need to do is get them to commit to something being wrong.
Mm-hmm.
How about racism? How about discrimination based on sexual orientation? How about killing people because you don't like their ethnic backgrounds, right? They're going to say there's some things that are wrong. And they don't get to make up whether they're wrong or right. They're not going to say, oh, that's wrong because I think it's wrong. Yeah. They're going to say, no, that's really wrong. And I'm going to fight against people who think it's right. And I'm going to protect the rights of the people whose rights would be violated if we allowed people to kill other people because of their race or ethnicity or their sexual orientation. Or just play on their own ball field. You got to think something's wrong. So you must think it's wrong for the state to interfere with a woman having an abortion if she wants to, right? You think that's really wrong, right? You don't just think, hey, that's my opinion. Or you don't just think, well, it could be right, it could be wrong. You think it's really wrong. Yeah. Now, you didn't get to just make up it's being wrong. You think it's over against us. It's a moral fact about the world. It's a moral fact about reality that stopping a woman from getting an abortion or killing somebody because of their race or whatever they think is wrong. Now we're off to the races because we've already eliminated the idea, the fundamental idea that you're talking about, that is that you can really make up your own moral universe, your own mental and moral universe. That's now gone, and now we're talking seriously. Yeah. Once we've admitted that there are some things that are wrong, not because we make it wrong, but because it's wrong over against us, and all we can do is know that it's wrong. We're not the ones who determined that it's wrong. All we can do is know that it's wrong. Then the only question is, how do we know it? And what things are right and what things are wrong. So that's now where the conversation is. Yeah. And I'm really happy to have that conversation.
Yeah. And I think Christians should be happy to have that conversation. So then do you tend to be in line with, a year ago, I did a podcast with Patrick Deneen from Notre Dame, and he wrote a book called Why Liberalism Failed, and just talked about it fails because it succeeds. Now, he's talking more about negative liberty that, freedom to do whatever I want, whenever I want, with whoever I want, however I want. Except for when you hurt somebody. And then his argument is that's kind of arbitrary, and we're all just going to argue over what it means to hurt somebody now. Do you fall in line with that sort of political philosophy of, I think they're called the post-liberals, or what would you critique in that philosophy, if anything?
Well, if I've understood Patrick correctly, and he's a former colleague here at Princeton, he was an assistant professor here. And then a few years later, he came back as a visiting fellow in my program, the James Madison Program, American Ideals and Institutions program that I had the honor to found and direct. Wow. So I know Patrick, and I know his work, have great respect for him and for his work. He is critical of the American founding and its principles, which he perceives as basically Enlightenment principles, in a way that
Yeah.
I'm not. And I suspect that, and again, he'd have to speak for himself, or I don't want to put words in his mouth.
Yeah.
I would suspect that I have a more expansive view of basic civil liberties like freedom of speech and freedom of religion and so forth than he or other post-liberals have. My civil libertarianism sometimes causes post-liberals to think of me as a liberal.
Sure.
They sometimes distinguish left liberals from right liberals, and they'll say, Robert George is a right liberal. I've always thought of myself as a conservative rather than as a liberal.
Yeah.
But they think of themselves as a conservative. And if they're conservatives, then I'm not really one. So what am I if I'm not a conservative? Well, I'm a right liberal as opposed to a left liberal. I don't care about the labels.
Sure.
Call me whatever you want to call me. But I do have strong convictions concerning civil liberties. And I do take a broad view of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. I don't think it's right to dismiss those as mere products of the Enlightenment. I see my own view of these matters as more Socratic, and in that way, ancient Greek than Enlightenment. But that's, I think, a difference between post-liberals and myself. I saw something by Patrick a year or so ago in which he suggested that I adopt the view that questions of the human good are purely private matters. And if in fact that's what he thinks I hold, then he's just mistaken, because I don't think that questions of the human good are purely private matters. In fact, I've made my career as a critic of that view, as exemplified, for example, in the work of the great, truly liberal late political philosopher, the Harvard political philosopher John Rawls. Rawls does think that questions of the human good are private matters, and that we can determine what's politically right and what rights people have independently of considerations of the human good, of what makes for or detracts from a valuable and morally worthy way of life. My first book, Making Men Moral, Civil Liberties and Public Morality, was a very sustained and pretty fervent attempt to refute that very view, that genuine, in my view, liberalism. So that's where we are.
Yeah, it's. I find it to be interesting as I've tried to figure this whole thing out. Obviously, I'm young, but like, how do I? So first, what are my political convictions? How do they relate to what I believe theologically? But second, then how do I sort of engage in the political discourse? And a lot of Protestants would say, you just need to tell people that the reason why you think certain things are true, why you think homosexuality is wrong, or gay marriage isn't actually a thing, is just because God said so. Now, for some people, they say that's actually not going to work. Because people don't believe in God. Why would you just argue that God said so with secularists who don't believe in God? It feels like your method is that you kind of come back to natural law, and you don't necessarily just tell people, hey, God said, homosexuality is wrong. God says abortion is wrong, so it's wrong, or that's the principles of the Bible. I guess I want to know, like, what brought you to that conviction that making the argument on the basis of natural law was more, persuadable, or you could persuade people more, but also, I guess, yeah. Why not just tell people, proclaim this is what Christ says, or this is what the Bible says, and leave it there? I'm interested in that sort of methodology question.
Okay. Well, as a Christian, I believe that God is a loving God, that God wills the good of man. God wills the salvation of all. May not all get there, obviously, through our own sinfulness. It's our fault. But God wills the best for us now and eternally. So if, in fact, that's right, if God is a loving God, then what he commands from us as far as our behavior is concerned, especially when it comes to moral questions,
Sure.
will line up with what is for our good, what is for the human good. A loving God, a God who loves human beings, will will the human good. Okay, then that suggests that God doesn't will things arbitrarily. It's just an arbitrary choice whether to will thou shalt not kill, or thou shalt kill people one is angry with, or thou shalt kill people of a different race, or what have you.
Right.
No, God says thou shalt not kill, and that's not arbitrary. If it's not arbitrary, that means there's a reason for it, or there are reasons for it. All right, then I want to know, what are the reasons? Why does God say thou shalt not kill? Why does God say thou shalt not commit adultery? Why does God say thou shalt not bear false witness against our neighbors? Or your neighbors. So fine, then it's just the quest for understanding those reasons. And that's all that natural law theory or natural law thinking is about, is trying to identify the reasons for the moral principles that are binding as a rational matter on human beings. I also think it's a mistake simply to suppose that natural law thinking or natural law theory has its utility exclusively in explaining to unbelievers why they should adhere to the principles that we know as Christians or as Jews because they're set forth in the Bible. There are lots of issues, including important contemporary issues and more to come, where the Bible does not speak. We don't have anything like a clear biblical witness or injunction. What's the Bible say about human cloning? What does the Bible say about surrogacy? If the Bible says anything about surrogacy, it seems to, in the case of the patriarchs, support it in the way that it seems to support polygamy and things like that. There's not a clear condemnation of slavery in the Bible, and slavery seems to be acceptable in the Bible. Now, how do we know that, slavery is contrary to the will of God and contrary to the human good and a grave injustice? Why are we right to be as we are today, so embarrassed and ashamed of our history in our own country of race-based chattel slavery? So it's not just, natural law is not just a way of explaining to people who don't accept the authority of the Bible or don't believe in God why they should follow the moral rules we find in the Bible. It's also our key to understanding things that would otherwise not be clear to us simply from reading the Bible.
This is
interesting. I think that contemporary evangelical thinkers have really come around to this view in recent years. There are some just outstanding Protestant evangelical natural law thinkers. My former student, Michael Watson at Calvin University, Andrew Walker at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, known as Southern Seminary. He's doing terrific work. Very much from an evangelical Protestant perspective on natural law theory, deploying natural law thinking. He's done a wonderful set of essays by different writers. He's edited it, included an essay of his own, but also essays by many other very fine writers, including Carl Trueman, on my work in natural law theory, trying to help make the kinds of work that I've done and other contemporary natural law thinkers who are not from the evangelical tradition available and useful to evangelical Protestants.
Yeah, I actually have it. That's social conservatism
for
the
there
common
it is.
good. Right
yeah,
there.
social conservatism for the common good.
Right. Yeah, and it's super interesting as I read through it. And actually, it's interesting. The natural law thing is. I was reading through Romans 1 the other day, and you get to the end of Romans 1, it's God's wrath against sinful humanity, and Paul's kind of explaining kind of the order of operations. You begin by suppressing the truth, and then you end that section by being supporters and advocates for people who do sinful things. But in verse 20, it says, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. So that it seems like Paul himself is making an appeal to natural law.
It's very clear right in the letter to the Romans where he says, he acknowledges, he invokes a law written on the hearts, even of the Gentiles. And of course, being Gentiles, they don't have the law of Moses, which is sufficient for them to be subject to judgment. In other words, held accountable. How can they be held accountable if they don't have the law of Moses? It's because there is the natural law, the law that is accessible by virtue of reason, even absent the scriptural revelation, the law written on the hearts.
Yeah. And this might sound like kind of a trivial question, but again, I think young people are having a very difficult time. As I read through your book, Conscience and Its Enemies, you teach law, you teach, and I'm, as a young person growing up in a liberal place, I never even put two and two together, which sounds ridiculous, just how important law is. Because I always just had the understanding that laws are just infringing on personal autonomy, on personal freedom, and Americans are kind of against laws in a lot of ways and just kind of letting people do whatever they want. More libertarian sort of perspective. That's just what I always thought. But there's also that I think it was John Adams said, a democratic republic will only work, under morally virtuous people or religiously virtuous people. That's a paraphrase. And so there seems to be, according to some of the founders, some sense in which we need to pursue virtue as citizens of this country. And so again, to the question of law, I think it's confusing for some young people and some young Christians like myself. Okay, so if I'm a Christian, I'm advocating for certain laws that uphold the biblical tradition, uphold things that are according to natural law, like a marriage between a man and a woman. At what point does your political philosophy or what you think should be implemented through law start to get in the way of the role and purpose of the local church in a community? Because I see sometimes people spend their whole life trying to get things implemented in law, but then they forget that the Great Commission exists and that we need to go and spread the gospel, because the only way that you're going to change people's hearts is through the gospel of Christ. And so how do you find yourself, you're in a position in which you're teaching about law, but how do you not convolute going out and being a public or advocating for certain governmental laws, not getting in the way of doing the Great Commission? Does that make sense? Like, how do you make sure you're doing both of those things, and how do Christians make sure they're doing both of those things without letting one convolute the other and kind of corrupt the other?
Well, if I've understood you, Andy, there are several questions in there. So
Yes.
let me pick one or two, and if you want me to talk about the others, just bring me back to them. So first of all, it's just a mistake to suppose that law is the enemy of freedom. Just imagine a world without law.
Yeah.
That is not a world safe for children and other living things.
Mm-hmm.
That's the law of the jungle.
Mm-hmm.
That's unlimited predation.
Right.
That's a situation in which the failure of coordination would mean catastrophes, even for people with the best will in the world, even if nobody sinned, even if nobody was selfish, even if nobody took more than their fair share of the common stock, you'd still have catastrophes, because human behavior has to be coordinated for the sake of the overall common good. And at least in any kind of developed society, there's no alternative to coordination by law.
Yeah.
So you don't want anarchy. Believe me, you don't want anarchy. Even in justifying his civil disobedience in Birmingham, Alabama, Dr. Martin Luther King, writing from the Birmingham jail after breaking the law, began by making the point that he doesn't break the law lightly, even where he feels morally obligated to do it. He doesn't do it lightly because the very worst situation is a situation of lawlessness. That's the most dangerous situation for freedom and for equality, for our most fundamental political values. So that's number one. Now, I mentioned earlier the first book I wrote. It's called Making Men Moral, Civil Liberties and Public Morality. And there I defend the view. It's a classic view. I didn't invent it. It was not a novel thought with me until really the 20th century. It was regarded as almost axiomatic. And that is the view that law does have a role to play in promoting virtue among the people, which, as you rightly quoted Adams as saying, is necessary for the maintenance of good government and a decent society, certainly necessary for the maintenance of a Republican constitution like ours. So law does have a role to play in promoting virtue. Law plays a very important educative function, sometimes called a pedagogical function. But I also argue at the same time that the role of law is subsidiary.
Okay.
That means it's secondary. It's not primary. The primary role of transmitting the virtues necessary for people to lead good lives and be decent citizens, the institutions with primary responsibility are the family first, and the church and other religious community second.
Mm-hmm.
They need to be given the autonomy and the independence, the authority to do their jobs, working with individual human beings. Law's role is behind them.
Mm-hmm.
It's very limited in what it can accomplish by way of soulcraft. The primary obligation on parents and families on the one hand, and then the church and religious communities on the other. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing that the law does. There's a lot that the law does, even in this secondary or tertiary capacity, by setting basic standards, by establishing and preserving a milieu in which parents and churches are assisted and not hindered in doing their work of virtue formation, especially, of course, obviously for children. So that means that the state has to respect the kind of area in which to do the work of virtue formation well, the person doing or the institution doing the formation has to know the individual by name. You have to know the child. You have to know that child's particular sensitivities and sensibilities, strengths and weaknesses, where the challenges are, and so forth. Are you married yet, Matt, and have Andy, and have children? Do you have children?
Yes.
You have more
two
than one?
kids.
Okay, if you have two, you already know what I'm about to tell you. Even in the same family with the same genetics, two kids can be totally different.
Absolutely.
Totally different in their sensibilities, their sensitivities, their strengths, their weaknesses, their needs, it can be so totally different. And you bring them up slightly differently, paying attention to those differences, informing them, including forming them in the virtues. The virtues are going to be the same. You want the same outcome, temperance, fortitude, kindness, decency, faith, hope, and love. The virtues remain courage. The virtues remain the same virtues, but getting them there, you handle somewhat differently because different kids are different. And it's the family and the church community that knows the individual, knows the kid by name. The state doesn't, the government doesn't, the law doesn't. So the law's got to stick to the really general stuff and leave the particulars where you really have to know the individual, know the child, to these institutions of civil societies, we call them, beginning with the family and the church, and then others as well, Little League and ballet and 4-H and Campfire Girls, and, and so forth and so on.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to know then what your thoughts are on the public school system. And because if you use this, principle of subsidiarity and you kind of work yourself out, for me, my wife, we've got a almost 2-year-old and then a child who's almost 1, and boy and a girl, and we're planning on homeschooling them. And I went to the public schools at a younger age, from kindergarten to the end of high school. And my understanding of the public schools is probably a bit different just because of how liberal Madison is. If I mention Christianity or my faith or anything conservative, I get kicked out of classes. I'd get mocked in front of the class by teachers and things like that. And I really struggled, and it was really difficult because it's like, how are you going to be a Christian and go up against an institution like that at 15 years old? And I failed in a million ways. But I guess my question would be then, can you justify a public school system? Because I just don't see a way in which any sort of government, even if the public school system is one in your town or your city of 10, 20, 30,000 people, how any of those people care about your kids as much as you do, or even close to as much as you do. And if you have one teacher for 25 students, how they can even care in any sort of fractional way for your child. I'm interested in your perspective on the public school system from K through 12, I'll say.
Well, I think really good teachers can handle large classrooms. I have no problem with that. I know that there, at least when I was growing up as a boy, there were Catholic nuns teaching in Catholic schools.
Sure.
Could have 60 second graders or first graders in her class or their classes, and do brilliantly, and that's fine. So that's not the fundamental problem. But I am starting to believe, just based on what I'm seeing, in the public schools and what I'm seeing from kids, who've been through the public school system, that the public schools have become like anarchy, dangerous for children and other living things.
Sure.
They're not doing the work of virtue formation, or if they are, they're certainly doing it poorly. And they're hampered in the ability to do it poorly because they've had imposed on them or have adopted, would adopt it anyway, even if it weren't opposed in many cases, probably in Madison, kind of secular progressive ideology that's a substitute religion. And it's a very poor religion. And you're not going to get virtuous kids brought up in that pseudo religion. So, I don't think today, it was different in a different era, but today it's, if I were a parent, bring up little kids today, I don't think I'd go anywhere near the public schools, certainly not here in Princeton, but as far as, other places in the country as well that I know, probably less left-wing than Madison or Princeton, I'd still be worried about the kids in the public schools. I really like what I'm seeing from homeschoolers. I really like the kids that I have in class who've been homeschooled. They're fantastic. I really like what I'm seeing from classical schools. The kids from the Christian classical schools are very, very well formed, both personally in terms of character and intellectually. Fantastic. I had the very high honor of speaking just a couple of months ago, or maybe less than that, a few weeks ago, at the new and first Jewish classical school that's being established in New York City. It's called the Emet Academy, and they had the inaugural convocation in the oldest in the country, the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, it's called, on the Upper West Side of New York City. And they kindly invited me to be the inaugural speaker there. And I did. And, they're going to produce the same kinds of outstanding students that I'm seeing coming out of the Christian classical schools. In fact, the curriculum is modeled very much on the Christian classical schools, but with an additional dose of both Hebrew language and Jewish sources, along with the other classic sources from the Western tradition and with Greek and Latin and so forth. I really like what I'm seeing there. And there's some other private academies. Some of them are ecumenical, not coming out of one particular tradition or another, Catholic or evangelical or Jewish or what have you, but very respectful of faith, not hostile to faith, and very focused on traditional learning. And those are producing great kids as well. So I think we're living in a time when, certainly for Christian families and other religious families, looking at alternatives to the public schools is the way to go.
Well, I've even seen that in some ways with, universities and colleges. Obviously, Jordan Peterson got very popular in the last decade or so, and he started Peterson Academy. And though it's not an accredited university and, it's an online sort of thing, I signed up for it, and the lectures are really, really, I'm actually really surprised by how good the lectures are and how good the teaching is. What do you think is going to happen with the universities? I mean, you're at Princeton, and Princeton is incredibly liberal, and it seems like people are either going in different directions or a lot of the good professors are speaking out against the problems at their own institutions. What's the future of in-person education at the university level? Because I think the in-person aspect of it is really important. I mean, I think it's, I can do online schooling, but it's good to interact with professors. Yeah.
Well, Andy, I'm asked all the time by parents, Christian parents, Jewish parents, religiously devout parents, Muslim parents even have asked me. Mormon parents have asked me, is it safe to send my kid to Princeton? Will I be sent back a kind of woke zombie? And they're asking that because it happens.
Right. They
know other families who've sent kids off to Brown or Oberlin or Stanford or wherever it is, and got back a woke zombie. They've got a shiny credential, and you can put some fancy sticker on the back of your car, Yale, or whatever. Right. But they haven't gotten an education, and the impact on their character and on their intellects has been devastating. So I get why they asked the question. And it depends on the institution. There's some places that I just would not send a kid just because it's entirely one way. It's entirely secular, progressive, woke left. There's no real opportunity for kids to hear a counter argument or other point of view. And they're just going to be indoctrinated. And as I often say, indoctrination is not only not education, it's the very antithesis of education. I'd much rather my students be ignorant than that they be indoctrinated. If they're ignorant, maybe I can teach them something. If they're indoctrinated, then before I can ever even get the process of teaching them anything up and running, I had to pry their minds open with a crowbar. And believe me, that's not easy when a kid has been thoroughly indoctrinated. But at a lot of places, including, I'm very glad to say, at Princeton, while you don't have a guarantee that your kid's not going to be sent home to you as a woke zombie, if a kid wants to get a serious education, he can get it here because there are people like myself, and it's not just me. Many of my colleagues, some conservative, some Christian, others not, either not religious or not conservative, old school type liberals, who do expose students to different points of view.
Yeah.
I want Princeton or the University of Wisconsin-Madison or any of these other non-sectarian universities, I want them not to be transformed into conservative indoctrination tanks. I want them to not be indoctrination tanks of any sort. I want my students to be exposed to the most powerful arguments from the left. I want them to read Marx and know him inside out.
Sure.
I want them to get to give Marx a sympathetic hearing. Let's hear what he says. Let's see what the argument is. Let's look at it in its best light. Let's see if it can be salvaged. But I also want them to hear the criticisms of Marx, whether they're from Hayek or Solzhenitsyn or John Paul II, any of the great critics of Marxism. I want them to hear both sides. And then I'm game. Let them decide for themselves where they think the truth lies. That's how I think of it as a parent. That's how I think of it as a teacher. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a legitimate place for a Wheaton College or a yeshiva university where there is a religious doctrine. It's not just, an open forum. There's a religious doctrine. And for some kids, that's the best option. But for a lot of kids, if you can get them to a place, even if its dominant ethos is a liberal and secular one, where there's a strong dissenting minority on the faculty that will ensure that they're exposed to competing points of view, they can get a really good education there too.
It's interesting because do you know who Michael Knowles is?
Yeah, I do. In fact, I was on a little panel with him recently at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute in Delaware. It was a panel with Michael Brendan Doherty and Michael Knowles and myself.
Well, yeah, I like Michael Knowles. I try to listen to him as many days as I can. I mean, he's doing podcasts all the time, but he wrote that book Speechless a couple of years back, and he made the argument that part of the definition of education is indoctrination. And so in some capacity, you do need to indoctrinate within the confines of education. Now, I guess there seems to be, to me, there's kind of what I've noticed is three ways of looking at education, or actually two ways. So one of them is sort of the indoctrination route. Of course, what you're going to indoctrinate with is the question. So it could be progressivism or it could be Christianity, whatever it is. And then there's sort of like what you're saying, that there's a sense in which you read all of the information, you talk about what these different thinkers think, and then you have conversations, you debate, you dialogue, and people figure out kind of what they think on their own. I'm not exactly sure where I land on this because there's some developmental sort of reality here too, because at a younger age you have to teach your kid.
No, so at a younger age, I mean, there's a place for catechism class.
Yeah, okay.
But it's not, in my view, I might differ from Michael on this. I haven't read that Speechless book, but in my view, the place for catechism class is not the university. Sure. Even if it's a religiously affiliated, if it's Notre Dame or Brigham Young or Yeshiva or Zaytuna or Baylor, I think catechism class is one thing. There's a place for that, but university learning is another thing. It's not catechism class.
Yeah, and then would you say about the seminaries that they kind of have a bit of a different approach as well?
There is, because there's a purpose. They are training clergy.
Yeah. Okay.
And there, the key thing is to train clergy to understand as deeply as possible in the context of the doctrine of the faith, what the doctrine of the faith is and what it means. Yeah. Now, there can be scholarly research with new findings, But the new findings should not contradict the doctrines of the faith. They would be the findings that we get by working out the full implications in context of the doctrines of the faith. If you've read John Henry Newman's famous essay on the development of doctrine, the great 19th century theologian and philosopher John Henry Newman, who was an Anglican priest, later became a Catholic and a Catholic cardinal. You'll see the way in which you can work within a tradition of faith, but in a way that yields new insights.
Yeah.
So there's a particular role for seminaries, but even that's not just catechism class. It's not indoctrination. You're working within the confines of a doctrine, though, a set of doctrines.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's interesting, because when you read through the kind of founding documents or founding statements of like Harvard and Yale and even maybe Princeton, because a lot of these schools started, as seminaries, so that they were trying to create, clergy and pastors, their vision and purpose is very specific. We want to create godly men to go out and, be pastors in the community and things like that. And so then when it starts to broaden out, and I don't know all of the history, then the philosophy around the education seems to begin to shift and change, because you're not just creating people who have a biblical sort of mandate that need to go out and actually preach the truth. You're talking about philosophy, you're talking about engineering and things like that. And so things start to shift and change, which is interesting. But would you say that there's a sort of presupposition that people need to take on in order to engage with? Like I think of the statement that was made in the last couple of years that math is racist. People will say math is racist, and it's a result of white patriarchy. All of the talking points that they use, and math is racist. But of course, math is logic. But in a lot of ways, the scientific method and certain ways in which we think about logic and reason have been produced in the West over the past 500-600 years as a result of sort of Western philosophy and the tradition there that comes from Judeo-Christian values. And in other parts of the world, they don't have logic and reason, and they don't uphold it in the same way that we do in the West. So is there a certain sense in which you need to instill a value system, or kind of indoctrinate into a value system the kids, so that they can learn when they get up to Princeton, that they can understand and how to think through issues logically and clearly, sort of in that Western tradition?
Well, again, there's a lot in that, Andy. Let me address the points that jump out at me, and you can tell me if there are other things that I've passed over and you'd like to bring me back to. First of all, I think it's important, while we should celebrate and recognize the great achievements of the West, and I think it is true that nothing quite like modern science has developed anywhere else, or I think could have developed anywhere else. It's important to also recognize that there have been great philosophical achievements in the Eastern traditions as well. Yeah. And there's no reason why we should not honor those, take them on board. I think the engagement between Western and various traditions of Eastern thought is a fruitful thing on both sides. Now, this idea that math is racist, that's just asinine. It's silly. It should just be dismissed. There's no point in talking with people who say things. There's no conversation possible. Right. Just grow up. But I'd also say that Christianity and Christians have absolutely nothing to fear from an education that exposes students to the best that has been thought and said by reasonable people, whether they're Christian or not, across the spectrum of viewpoints and from whatever cultures have contributed to reflection on the subject matter. So when I was a student as an undergraduate, I studied Theravada Buddhism. And I actually learned a lot that was interesting and useful from engaging with that tradition. I wasn't on the verge of becoming a Buddhist. I didn't really consider becoming a Buddhist. There was nothing in there that attracted me to change religions. But I studied with a very distinguished monk. He had been the abbot of the seminary in Chiang Mai, the big seminary, big abbey in Chiang Mai, Thailand. He had the honorific title Jiao Kun. We knew him as the Jiao Kun Rajavara Muni. And that was fascinating. And it was very interesting, especially to compare Buddhist attitudes toward our stance toward the world with Western Stoic ideas, especially Roman Stoic ideas. There are interesting points of commonality and difference between these two major philosophical traditions, Stoicism and Buddhism, both of which prioritize a certain detachment from the world and a detachment from our emotional engagements. So all that's great. I have no problem, quite the opposite, with an education that exposes students to powerful criticisms of Christianity. I think any serious learner, anybody who's interested in ideas, Christian or otherwise, has to read Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German thinker, who, to my mind, is the most powerful and compelling critic of Christianity in the modern period. Sure. Now, why would I, as Christian, want my students to be reading Nietzsche? Is it because I think Nietzsche's right? No, I think Nietzsche's wrong.
Right.
But he makes some powerful points, reflection on which deepens our understanding of the Christian faith. So I'm not afraid, nor should any Christian be afraid to consider the best that has been thought. And Marx is obviously an atheist, a materialist, an opponent of Christianity and Judaism.
Yeah.
I nevertheless have my students read Marx.
Sure.
Why? Because I think Marx is right? No. But because I think there's something to be learned from the engagement of Marx with Marx by Christians and others whose worldviews are very much antithetical to the Marxist worldview. In Marx's case, I happen to think that his philosophy has been responsible for some of the worst tragedies in human history. Nevertheless, I want my students to engage with this thinking. Now, if you're the kind of parent who thinks, man, I never want my kid reading Marx or reading Nietzsche, then you're not going to want to follow my advice. You're not going to want to send your kid to Princeton or any place else that's going to expose students to that broad a range of views. You're going to want them at a Christian place, and not just at a Christian place, but a place where, you know, the works of Marx and Nietzsche simply aren't on the agenda, simply aren't read. But as for me, I see great value actually in engaging with not only non-Christian thinkers, but with critics of Christianity.
And actually,
as long as they're serious. Now, here I draw a distinction.
Yeah.
I mean, if you got some idiot who says, you know, math is racist, then, you know, don't go there.
Yeah.
But that's not Nietzsche. Nietzsche's not an idiot. He's very powerful, very deep. He raises serious questions that we as Christians should be wrestling with.
Yeah, and even, you know, for those parents, if there are any that think that, if there are any listening to this podcast, because I know that there are parents who think that their kids shouldn't interact with anything other than kind of what they think is absolutely true. It seems to me like those kids kind of go through an identity crisis when they get out on their own at 18, 19, 20 years old. That they go out into the world and they're like, wow, I didn't know all these other ideas existed, and now I don't know how to defend myself. I don't know what I actually believe. I recognize that I grew up in an echo chamber a little bit, and you can grow up in a Christian echo chamber in an unhealthy way. At least I think. I mean, one of the good things about growing up in Madison, one of the good things about growing up in Madison was I was forced to interact with some of a lot of the philosophies that I think are totally opposed to Christianity. And the question for a lot of people in Madison is, are you a Christian or not? Because there's a lot of ways that you can just not be a Christian. And I had to figure out whether or not I was actually a Christian or if I wanted to do what the world was going to do. And that was a difficult thing to figure out. And I'm glad that I landed on the Christian side of things. But I totally see what you're saying. And I think that that's good. And actually one of the big cultural figures right now that I think Christians are trying to figure out how to interact with is Jordan Peterson, because he's takes the psychological perspective and he interprets scripture through the psychological perspective in a way that I think is not biblically accurate or theologically accurate, and can twist the gospel in certain ways. And I've seen a lot of Christians. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago where they talked about this, how to engage the sages of our age, the philosophers of our age. And they talked about Jordan Peterson, and they showed a clip of Jordan Peterson talking. And it all sounded good. And one guy, after the clip was yelled out in the breakout class. He said, "Well, man, Jordan Peterson, that's the gospel. He's talking about the gospel." And of course, Jordan Peterson was not talking about the gospel, but what he was saying sounded in some ways like the gospel, but it was kind of a works based. You need to like pull your weight and take on the responsibility of the world, rather than the grace gospel of Christ that, you can't take on the responsibility of the world. Christ will do that for you and die on the cross. So because we haven't been able, because I think a lot of Christians have, I guess, shied away from that sort of conversation or even reading people that they disagree with. Now you get people who are similar, like Jordan Peterson. They have a really difficult time figuring that out. Would you say that that's true?
Well, I don't know that much about Jordan Peterson.
Okay.
I occasionally do run into the problem of parents who just do not want their kids to be exposed to non-Christian sources. I think that's what Christian fundamentalism is today, but I only occasionally run into it. What I find much, much more often is a different kind of fundamentalism. And that is woke fundamentalism. Mm-hmm. So students, faculty members, others who don't want themselves or students to be exposed to critics of left-wing secular progressive ideology, especially social liberalism. They don't want their kids to hear the argument against abortion or for marriage as the conjugal union of husband and wife. They want to stigmatize even making the argument so kids will never be exposed to it. The real fundamentalists today are not Christians.
Yeah. Yes.
They're woke left. I mean, they're just replicating the very attitudes that they condemn and regard themselves as having transcended, and the attitudes that they themselves hold in contempt. Well, there they are, embodying and exemplifying these very attitudes. And fortunately, it's funny. It's amusing. At least you can laugh. At least you can laugh at it. But I do. I mean, just as far as my own advice to parents, there's nothing to be afraid of here. Let your kids engage the best that has been thought and said across the spectrum. Kids are smart; they'll figure it out. We should probably use this occasion to say a word about knowing, about knowledge. This is about what philosophers call epistemology. Because I think it's relevant to this question of education and what parents should be looking for in education. And here I want to say, Andy, that it's one thing to know that something is the case, and that's a good thing. It's better than not knowing that it's the case. But there's a difference between knowing merely that something is the case so that you could check the right box on a multiple choice test like an SAT. It's another thing, and a deeper thing, and a richer thing, and a better thing to know not only that something is the case, but why it is the case, and how it is the case, and how it may relate to other things that are the case, especially if it's pertaining to an important matter, matters of meaning and value, matters of human nature, the human good, human dignity, human destiny.
Sure.
And a real education doesn't just give you the answers, check the box. A real education is one in which, by wrestling with the questions, you figure out not only that something is the case, but why it's the case, or how it's the case, and how it's being the case does relate to other things. I was teaching a seminar, I guess it's now 3 years ago, with my very dear friend, the eminent historian of the American Civil War and biographer of Lincoln, Alan Gelzo. And Alan and I were teaching the seminar on the history and purposes of universities. We have 12-week seminars here at Princeton, and I had a wonderful group. We had a wonderful group of about 20 really outstanding students. We really hit the jackpot with our students. These were the sharpest kids. They were just so brilliant. I guess we had a lot of brilliant kids at Princeton, but even by the normal Princeton standards, these kids were off the charts. And for 10 weeks, we had these great conversations, and I kept getting a little kind of a feeling that while the students were formally pretty much in agreement that the purpose of universities was to seek knowledge of truth, that somewhere, despite that formal agreement, there was a disagreement about exactly what that meant. Sure. And it was only late in the game, about the 10th week, that I began to see that it was a difference between those who thought that knowledge really just consisted in knowing that something is the case, and those who thought that no, real knowledge is is knowing not simply that something is the case, but how it's the case and why it's the case, and so forth. And so I put to the group, in order to tease this out, the following challenge. And maybe you and your listeners can think about how you'd answer this challenge yourself, or this question.
Sure.
I said, I'm going to give you two options. Option one, I'm going to give you a fallacious argument for a true proposition about something important, something that matters, on which you don't know what to think. My argument, though fallacious, will convince you. And as a result of accepting my fallacious argument, you will now believe something that is true, which you otherwise would still be up in the air about. You wouldn't believe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Option 2. This time, I'm going to give you a valid argument, a sound argument, for the same true proposition about a very important thing. This time, however, my argument, though valid, though sound, you will not find compelling. You will not find ultimately persuasive, as a result of which you will still not affirm that answer.
Yeah.
Which do you want me to give you? You have to choose one or the other.
Right.
And the class divided.
Really?
Just as I suspected. Yeah. Huh. The first 2 kids right out of the box without a moment's thought immediately, and they were brilliant kids, 2 of the most brilliant kids in this especially brilliant class of kids, immediately said, option 1, obviously, I want to know what the truth is. And that'll move me from being in a situation where I don't have a true belief in my head, or perhaps have a false belief in my head, to one in which I have a true belief in my head. Who doesn't want that? Of course, give me I want the right answer. So even if it's a fallacious argument, if it gets me to the right answer, that's knowledge. But then on some reflection, a couple of the other kids, including the most brilliant kid in the class, pops up and says, no, that's wrong. No, give me the sound argument, make me wrestle with it, make me think. And if I don't get to the truth as a result of that, I'm still better off than just believing something that's true on a false basis.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that one thing that convinced me of this sort of method that you're talking about was one of my favorite theologians, actually probably my favorite theologian, is J.I. Packer. And he wrote a book called The Heritage of Anglican Theology. Not many people have read it. I read it, and he talks about the purpose of theology in the beginning, and he discussed it in a way that I had never heard before, probably because I was in non-denominational churches and they don't theologize very well. And he said the purpose of theology is to turn your affections towards God, or to know God in a deep, affectionate way, to know why he does things, to know who he is, what his character is. It's not just to know things about God. And he talked about how there were people that he knew who had come to the wrong conclusions theologically, according to him, but they theologize in a way in which they're trying to know why God is doing things. They're trying to know who he is and what his character is. And so though they come to some wrong conclusions, they're functioning as legitimate Christians. Whereas he knew some other people who they knew the right thing. They had the right answers, but they didn't theologize in the right way. They didn't interact with their Christian faith in a way in which they were turning their affections towards Christ, trying to know more about him, who he is and his character, and why he does things. And he's like, those people, they didn't function as Christians. They just had all of the right answers for the test questions, but they didn't know why they were doing it, or what the purpose of it was, and what the end goal of it is. And he's like, I'd rather the person that comes to some of the wrong conclusions, but is doing it all for the right reasons and has the right method, than the other person. And that just totally blew my mind, because for a long time I thought, well, the most important thing is just to know the true thing, and then just to, kind of like those first 2 students, just give me the right answer, and I think other things will kind of fill themselves out.
I think you can show that the correct. I held back before saying this because I wanted the kids to be wrestling with my problem. But for those who say I want option 1, even I want the right answer, even if I'm led there by a fallacious argument, I would then say, here's option 3. Now tell me, those of you who chose option 1, whether you'd choose this one. Arguments are messy. They take time. They're hard to understand. I've got in my pocket here a little pill. And if you take the pill, you will now believe the true proposition. So we can dispense with the argument, which is fallacious anyway. And I'll give you the pill, and you will now believe the true proposition. You want the pill? And that stops students. And they think, well, wait a minute. No, I'm not going to take the pill.
Yeah.
But if you're not going to take the pill, you shouldn't take the fallacious argument, even though it leads you to the true proposition.
Right, because to not take the pill is basically to say I find value in whatever it takes to get to the truth. Essentially,
exactly.
Yeah, that is bizarre. That's something I need to think about more, because I would suspect that a lot of people. I actually think the people that I'm around, maybe would take the pill. Some people that I know might take the pill. But even so, some people might take just the true answer. And it's kind of a tempting thing to just grasp at the truth and kind of skip all of the difficulties and trying to figure it out, because it's like, then you got to read books and you got to listen to a bunch of different people, and then people disagree. And then you're like, what in the world do I think? Do you find that young people in particular have a really hard time making the decision? So as a young person myself, and as a Christian, and I'm Protestant, you come to a point as a Protestant Christian where you have to decide Calvinism or Arminianism. And I know people will try to be like, you can mix them both. You can't mix them both. So let's just say Calvinism or Arminianism. And some people have like a crisis, like a theological crisis, and they can't figure it out because they have to make a decision. They have to take a path. And this is the case with a lot of different issues in life, not just theological, but who am I going to marry and things like that. And young people, seems to me, they get paralyzed. I can't make a decision. I'm just going to sit here. Chesterton talks about in Orthodoxy, and I'm probably going to botch this, in his book Orthodoxy, where he says, like, two people come to a point in their path in which you could either go one way or the other way. And so one person wants to go this way, and one person wants to go that way. And so they're at a fork in the road. They just stand there. They don't do anything. And he says it in a much better way. But do you find that young people that are coming to your classes at Princeton are having a hard time when they get to that point where they actually have to make the decision? When they've heard the arguments, they just stand there and they say, I don't want to make a decision. This is too scary. As I'm finding that, I don't know.
No, I myself have not run into that. I mean, the key thing is, in my experience, to move students out of dogma, which is usually an ideological dogma, into thinking. So they tend to come with their heads stuffed full of a certain ideology. They don't know why they believe it, but have never really thought about why they believe it. It's what everybody else believed, everybody in their school, all their teachers. It's what they think smart people believe. If you don't believe it, you're a racist or whatever. You're a transphobe. You're this or that. Yeah. And so they're zealous in their belief in it, but have no idea why they believe it, and really no idea of what possible counter arguments there are to it, and no conception of why, for most of human history, other people have not believed it. They just say, well, those are bad people, and today we're good people, and good people believe this. So it's moving them from that dogmatism to actually thinking. That's the big challenge. It's not that I find students, when they've been presented with the best that has been thought and said, get paralyzed and can't make a decision. They usually make a decision. They wrestle with it. Of course, it takes time. Because issues are hard. Lots of issues are hard. Either they're intrinsically hard, or they're hard in the cultural circumstances that we find ourselves in, even if they're not intrinsically hard. So it takes a while to wrestle with them. But I have not seen the problem with paralysis.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I want to shift gears and then wrap it up. I just have one more question.
Sure.
Because you have your friendship with Cornel West, and Cornel West and you don't seem to agree on many things. And so it's an interesting thing from afar to see two people that are kind of diametrically opposed on most things, politically, philosophically, theologically, in some capacity, develop a friendship. And it sounds shallow, and I'm from a very shallow generation in which being friends with somebody that you disagree with is a dangerous thing, and that's what a lot of people think. How did you do it? How are you guys friends? What is it? What is there some core values that you guys kind of agree on, or what is it about this friendship that makes it work?
We both aspire, and this is the great point of commonality. I recognize it in him. He recognizes it in me. When I see him, I immediately see it. When he sees me, he immediately sees it. What's the it? It's the aspiration. Don't always get there. We don't live up to it, but it's the aspiration we share to form ourselves to be determined truth seekers and courageous truth speakers. And obviously, relatedly, we share a view of our vocation as teachers, and that is to form our students by both precept and example to form our students as courageous truth seekers. As determined truth seekers and courageous truth speakers. That's the big point of commonality. I know a truth seeker when I see one. I know a fellow truth seeker when I see one. I know someone with the courage to speak the truth as God gives them to see the truth. Going to be wrong about it sometimes, maybe wrong about it a lot of times, but having the courage to speak what we believe to be the truth. I admire that. I admire it in him. He admires it in me. That's a lot of common ground to begin with.
Sure. Yeah.
We share the belief that people need to be free to explore, to think, to talk, to argue, to reflect. So we're fervent partisans, I would say. I would even use that term, of freedom of thought and inquiry and discussion. We're both free speech advocates. We're both strong civil libertarians. I brought that up in relation to that question you asked me earlier about post-liberalism. So that's a lot of common ground. We're also fellow Christians. We believe in the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family as a creature made in the very image and likeness of God. Now we draw different political conclusions from, in some ways, not all, but some differences in how we interpret that or how we think it applies to contemporary issues. But we still affirm it together, which puts us in the minority of our colleagues, whether they're of the left or the right in academic life. So that, I think, has enabled us to establish and sustain a really deep friendship, to work together. I love him very much. He loves me. Our families are connected. We do things together. We enjoy each other's company. I love teaching with him. We're not able to do that anymore because he has left Princeton many years ago now to go on first to Harvard, and now he's at Union Theological Seminary. Although on one occasion he took a leave when he was at Harvard and came back to Princeton, and we taught our seminar together. But those were really memorable, wonderful seminars when we were teaching together. And now that we're no longer able to teach together, at least not regularly, we go out together, take our show on the road. We give talks together at universities and professional associations, and we talk to a big hospital group and all sorts of venues. But it's been a very valuable part of my own intellectual life and personal life, and I'm very grateful for Brother Cornel.
Did you vote for Cornel West for president?
I am a absolutely strict pro-life voter. I don't vote for anybody who does not uphold the pro-life cause. And to my regret, doing the best he can, he's just reached a different conclusion on that. Maybe he'll change his view about it. Hope so. But I know he's a truth seeker, and he's open to argument, and we do argue about that and other things.
His introductory video, when he kind of announced that he was running, I was like, well, this is really good. It was convincing. He has a lot of passion. And some of the things that he was saying, I was like, wow, this is more conservative than some conservatives, or some so-called conservatives that I know of, Yeah.
And he did show what it means to be a candidate. Now, he wasn't a major candidate or a major party candidate, but he did show what it means to be a candidate who, says what he means and means what he says, and doesn't, change his views to conform to whatever he thought political expediency required. He stood up for what he believed in. Yeah. And gosh, that's like water in the desert these days. I mean, you saw Kamala Harris, repudiate things she claimed to believe passionately until yesterday, when it became politically expedient to get rid of them. You saw Donald Trump abandon the pro-life cause when it became politically expedient or inexpedient for him to hold up the pro-life cause. Cornel didn't do anything like that. I mean, he told you what he believed. He stuck with what he believed. He's open to changing his mind under the pressure of reason and argument, but he did not shake or trim or alter his positions based on political expediency.
Good. Yeah. I mean, that's you're right. It is a rare thing for people to have conviction nowadays, to just say what they think is true.
And integrity.
And integrity. Exactly. Man, like I appreciate you doing this podcast. I feel like I've learned a lot. It's an interesting thing. I've I'm not fully through the book Conscience and Its Enemies, but it's so interesting. And I can see the trains of thought that, I think of Carl Trueman's book. There's similarities between The Rise and Triumph and some of the things that he's saying in that, and then in your book. And so there's this stream of political thought and cultural thought, and how these things overlap, and theological thought that I find myself gravitating toward. I just feel like I need to understand it better and need to read more. And so I appreciate you taking time to actually talk, because I'm lucky to be able to actually talk with somebody like you who's written these books.
Well, it's my pleasure, Andy.
Yeah.
I hope we'll get a chance to talk again. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.